Gogo Aubrey Matshiqi, thank you so much.
Amako.
Thank you so much for sharing yourself with us, for always being available to speak to us, for resonating, for illuminating, for all the work you do, and
Amako.
for being you, you know.
Siyabulela.
People, when they see you, they don't know how warm, what a warm spirit you are, and how loving you are. And thank you for that.
And thank you for lying.
But I guess you paid me that money, so I have to do something.
I can live with those lies.
Thank you, thank you. So, you know, as this country of ours shifts and shapes and does things, you're one of the voices that we always want to hear from, to understand what's going on, because obviously things are not just happening in a vacuum. It's all part of a historical context, you know. We are where we are because of the Land Act, of the Urban Areas Act, of all these acts that happened prior, of colonialism. So now we're in 2025, little bit post-GNU. We asked you to come in today just to unpack the political situation, and please go into each party and what they represent, who they are in the spectrum, so that we can, so that our baby can take shape, you know, and we go somewhere.
Well, first of all, I worry about the plight of our people. We must not forget that the struggle against apartheid colonialism was not a struggle for democracy. It was a struggle for freedom. And democracy would be one of the means by which that freedom is achieved. And what freedom are we talking about? Freedom in terms of that which was colonized. The mind was colonized. Therefore, the struggle against apartheid colonialism is a struggle for mental freedom. The body was colonized. And therefore, the struggle against apartheid colonialism was a struggle about freeing the body. More importantly, the spirit was colonized. And therefore, the struggle against apartheid colonialism was a struggle about freeing the spirit, particularly our relationship with our ancestors, particularly our relationship with the land. Because remember that the land is sacred. Without it, we are nothing. The land is life. And therefore, to deny me land or to uproot me from my land, you deny me access to that which is sacred and to that which was sacred to our ancestors. One of the things post-apartheid we have not done is to deal effectively with the land question. We hear a lot being said about the land, but in practice, very little is happening to reconnect us with and to the land, which means to the extent that the struggle against apartheid colonialism is a struggle about remembering that which was dismembered, including the fact that we have become dismembered from the land, from that which is sacred. The work of remembering us, or those who are oppressed, is not happening sufficiently. And there is a reason why this is not happening. It is because throughout the continent, we have the same problem. African leaders from Cape to Cairo African governments from Cape to Cairo are a curse to the people of this continent. Mm. They are a curse, amongst other reasons, because they have become allies of coloniality. In other words, they have become allies by promoting, consciously or unconsciously, a logic through which the oppression and colonization of the African happened. That is why I say African leaders, African governments have become a curse to the people of this continent. And this is from Cape to Cairo, including our own government, and therefore including the ANC in particular. The ANC has become a curse to the people of this country. And the question I keep on asking is this: what is African about the ANC? And I struggle to find an answer. I struggle to see the connection between the ANC and that which is African. What I do not struggle to see is the fact that the ANC has become an ally of coloniality.
Why do you emphasize that it's not African? What is the importance of it being African or not being African?
Well, just imagine that today is the first day we encounter the white colonizer, the white Christian colonizer, who comes here armed with the mission to so-called civilize us, but comes here with a mission to impose a particular way of being in the world, a particular way of seeing, and therefore a particular worldview. And included to that, in that, is the imposition of a particular religion. What does the white Christian colonizer do? Not only does the Christian colonizer oppress the body, as I said, oppresses the mind, oppresses the spirit. Now, what happens in that process is that our relationship with God, or our relationship with the divine, as we understand it, because as I say, we're imagining today is our first encounter with the white Christian colonizer. So one of the first things the white Christian colonizer does is to disrupt our relationship with the divine, our relationship with God. God as we understand God to be. But the white Christian colonizer does something else. It is to remove us from our ancestors. It is to disrupt our relationship with our ancestors. Now, firstly, the colonizer removes us from God as we understand God to be, and removes us from our ancestors. The effect of that is devastating, because we are removed from who we are and from what we are. We are removed from the fact that actually this is the birthplace of humanity. And therefore, we remove ourselves, or we are removed from those first ancestors of humanity. These are not just the ancestors of Africa, as we know Africa as what Africa has become now. Those first ancestors that gave birth to all the 8 billion people in the world are not just the ancestors of those today we call African. They are the ancestors of humanity as a whole. So, colonialism removes us from these ancestors who are the ones who gave birth to all of humanity. Therefore, not only us, but the colonizer himself is removed from these ancestors by what he does. And to remove us from these ancestors who gave birth to humanity is to remove us from who we are. Amongst other things, to be African is to have a relationship with these first ancestors who gave birth to all of humanity. And therefore, what is it that we have done since 1994 to reconnect us to these ancestors? In other words, what is it that we have done to reconnect us to our essence, our Africanness? Very little. In fact, we participate ourselves in crimes like linguicide. For instance, you and I, Mamia, were speaking to each other in English, not through the languages that were handed down to us by these ancestors over thousands and thousands of years. We speak to each other through a language that was imposed on us, through the act of linguicide. In other words, the colonizer engages in the act of killing our languages. That is why I say the colonizer perpetrates the crime of linguicide. What is it that we have done? You, Mami, talk a lot about these schools you were taken to, that we take our children to. They themselves, these schools, have become purveyors, amongst other things, of this linguicide I'm talking about. This linguicide, in part, is happening through these schools that you were taken to. So in part, what these schools do is to continue with the act of dismembering us from that which was sacred to us. Because remember, education has a reproductive function. And also remember, education is not neutral. Education is ideological. One of the things education must do is to reproduce dominant race, class, cultural, gender, and so on, relations. Which means, in terms of its reproductive functions, education must make us uncritical of how we have become what we have become. We must become uncritical of why we have become dismembered from that which is sacred to us. Because education plays that reproductive function, precisely because it is ideological. What must education do? it must reproduce the power of those who are dominant in society. It must reproduce their worldview. It must reproduce their way of being in the world. It must reproduce their understanding of reality. It must reproduce their way of seeing. In short, it must reproduce their worldview. And one of the ways through which we do this is through the education system. The school, the university, our education system plays that reproductive function. And it does something worse to our minds. Not only are we uncritical of the social, political, and economic relations we see, but what it has done to our minds is that our educational institutions, or our education institutions, as Henry Thoreau puts it, have become dead zones of disimagination. And the reason why we struggle to reimagine our future and to reimagine the relationship between the present, the past, and the future is partly because of what is done to our minds by our education system. A system that has turned education institutions into dead zones of disimagination. And one of the main perpetrators here, as an ally of coloniality, is the African National Congress. And this is one of the reasons I ask, what is African about the African National Congress?
When we speak of the education system, and if you're saying it's dead zones, then what is the solution? When we speak of decolonization of the education system, what are we actually saying?
Well,
in practical terms,
the first thing we do, or must do, is to engender amongst our children, in society in general, particularly those who were victims of colonialism, powerful critiques about this crime of colonialism and apartheid colonialism. Our children must be in a position to understand why we have become what we have become. Some people will talk about the decolonial, the imperative, as you say, of decolonizing our education system and the content of education. I would go further and say it is not enough to decolonize the mind of the oppressed. Actually, the first mind we must decolonize is the mind of the descendant of the colonizer. In short, to the extent that white people globally are descendants of the colonizer, or coloniality as a global phenomenon.
Yeah.
It is the mind of the descendant of the colonizer that we must decolonize first. Or the two must happen together at the same time. What we tend to do, and I think it's a mistake, we focus on the mind of the oppressed and say that the imperative is to decolonize the mind of the oppressed. So people like Bob Marley, Steve Biko, I'm not saying they were wrong when they talked about the imperative of mental freedom. They were not wrong. But what you must add to what they were saying or what they said is the imperative of decolonizing the mind of the oppressor, decolonizing the mind of the descendant of the oppressor. Because ours remains a neo-colonial reality. We used to talk about colonialism of a special type, talking about the fact that the oppressor and the oppressed, the colonizer and the colonized, are located within the same geographical borders. Now, colonialism may be gone, but coloniality is still very much alive. And it is responsible for perpetuating conditions in South Africa I refer to as neo-apartheid conditions. If you look at it from the perspective, let's say, of the Freedom Charter, which says South Africa belongs to all who live in it, I say, because South Africa does not belong to all who live in it, South Africa should, in other words, it's an aspiration. It's not something we've achieved yet. South Africa should belong to all who live in it because it doesn't. South Africa still belongs to those who conquered it, who are still governed by the logic of coloniality. Which means, to the extent that they are still governed by the logic of coloniality, which in part continues to perpetuate conditions of neo-colonialism and neo-apartheid. One important task is to change all the social, political, and economic realities which betray the existence of the fact that South Africa belongs to those who conquered it. Let me repeat something I've said many times. I have said, because of apartheid and colonialism, a numerical minority in South Africa has become the cultural majority whose ways of being, whose ways of seeing, whose ways of doing, and worldview have become the dominant reality in our post-apartheid setting. And the numerical majority has become a cultural minority whose ways of seeing, whose ways of doing, whose ways of being in the world, whose worldview is subordinate to that of this numerical minority that has become a cultural majority. We must transition towards an order which changes this.
I'm listening to you say about we need to work on the minds of the oppressor. And I'm wondering, how do you begin the conversation to a privileged somebody to let go of their privileges to accommodate everybody else. Nobody wants to let go of what they believe is mine.
Well, let me say this. The reason I'm laughing, I'm thinking, you know, I was a Marxist, Leninist, materialist, a member of the South African Communist Party. So I'm laughing because I'm thinking, you know, you can take a man out of the Communist Party, but it is difficult to take the communism out of that man. Why am I saying that? It is not fashionable now to talk about Karl Marx. But one of the things Karl Marx said is that privilege blinds one to reality. In other words, privilege blinds us who are privileged to reality. We talk a lot, some of us these days, about the emergence of a new consciousness, not only in the world, not only on this planet, but across planets, in the universe, in the multiverse, and beyond. A new consciousness is coming into being. And that new consciousness will result in the delivery of a new reality in the world, in the universe, in the multiverse, and beyond. But of course, as good as that is, we need to contend with a change in consciousness, where we are, where we live as bodies. Now, what tends to happen? And maybe now I'm going back to my Marxist, Leninist, materialist roots. When some of us talk about this emerging consciousness, people seem to think this consciousness will happen by or through osmosis. In other words, it will happen through a process similar to the autopilot function of an aeroplane. Whereas it will and must happen through struggle. So this new consciousness is not just going to emerge through osmosis or through a process similar to the autopilot function of an aeroplane. It will emerge through a process of struggles. And that means you decolonize the mind of the descendant of the colonizer, in part through struggle, in part through dialogue. A dialogue that recognizes the fact that what binds the descendant of the colonizer and the descendant of the colonized is their common humanity. And therefore, together, in terms of this common humanity, must struggle for the emergence of this new consciousness as bodies located where they are located, in this case, South Africa.
Nobody's going to want to struggle. If you're privileged, why would you want to struggle?
Well, we have seen in the history of this country that it is possible for those who benefited from colonialism and apartheid colonialism to enjoin themselves in struggles against the same colonialism and apartheid colonialism. Now, the fact that they did means that while this happened in the past, it can happen in the future. And in part, it will be a function of leadership. And here I'm not talking about leaders, I'm talking about leadership. Leadership residing in those who are leaders and those who are not leaders. The descendants of the colonized will have to provide leadership in terms of persuading the descendants of the colonizer that it is in their interests to engage in struggle together to ensure that we remove the vestiges of our colonial and apartheid past.
I'm wondering what Abelungu are wondering what it looks like. What does this thing look like? What does expropriation look like? What does struggle look like? Does it mean that I must let go of my house in Bryanston and go live in a shack and then give my house to other people how I pledge my, like, what does it look like? I'm sure the white community also wants to know, okay, when they say justice or we're trying to balance, what are we actually saying to them? What do they have to let go of, or what do they have to do? Or
well, the first thing they must do is to acknowledge they benefited from the crimes of colonialism and apartheid colonialism. Secondly, they must embrace the idea that it is incumbent on those who benefited from the crimes of colonialism and the crime of apartheid colonialism to be magnanimous. In what respect? The land is in the hands of the descendants of colonialism and apartheid colonialism. The rule of law is in the hands of the descendants of colonialism and apartheid colonialism. The economy is in the hands of the descendants of colonialism and apartheid colonialism. The ways of seeing, the ways of being in the world, the ways of doing, and the worldview that are dominant are those of the descendants of the colonizer, the beneficiaries, or those who benefited from colonialism and apartheid colonialism. With respect to these things, their control over the economy, their control over the land, their control over the rule of law, and their control over other areas of our life is something they need to give up. So when I say they must be magnanimous, their magnanimity must kick in by way of giving up control of these things for the benefit of all. They have a choice. They can either do it voluntarily or they'll be forced to do it by means that are not peaceful. It's up to them. Now, if we come back to our immediate circumstances, there is an Ipsos survey that has just come out, which says 80% of South Africans believe that South Africa is going in the wrong direction. And 70% of children in this country live in poverty. I can tell you now, the majority of those children are not the children of the descendants of the oppressor or descendants of the colonizer. These are the descendants of those who are colonized. These are the descendants of those who are oppressed. In many ways, those who are oppressed today live under conditions that are worse than the conditions we had during apartheid colonialism. What that means, I will warn once again, that when I look at our socioeconomic conditions, South Africa is heading towards a perfect storm of discontent. The discontent of the poor, the discontent of the working poor, the discontent of the working class, and the discontent of the middle class. We are heading towards a perfect storm of discontent. And if the descendants of the oppressor, the descendants of the colonizer, do not give up that which they control at the expense of the majority in this country, they will one day have to face a very stark choice. To give these things up voluntarily or to be forced to give them up by means that are not peaceful. It's up to them.
Where are the black privilege in all of this?
Well, black privilege does exist. But it is not the defining problem in South Africa. The defining problem in South Africa is still the privilege of those who are white. This is similar to something else I like saying. You look at the failures and weaknesses of the ANC, which have been quite egregious. And what we do sometimes, we allow white people to use the failures, egregious failures of the ANC and the weaknesses of the ANC to erase the sin of apartheid. We must not allow that. In the same way, the privilege of some who are black does not erase the fact that the preponderance of those who are privileged is white. So we must not lose focus when it comes to who must give up control over the economy, the land, rule of law, and so on. It is those who benefited from the crimes of colonialism and apartheid colonialism. And I will keep on saying, this will happen either voluntarily or by force. It is up to them.
You just said something that sounded almost like you're saying that poverty and the condition of this country is worse off than in apartheid. Is that what you were saying?
I'm saying, well, inequality, definitely, has never been this bad. Poverty amongst those who are oppressed has never been this bad. Now, for me, there are two main reasons. First of all, as I said, those who lead us from Cape to Cairo have become a curse to the people of this continent, particularly those who are oppressed. So when you look at indicators like poverty and inequality, yes, we are in a worse place than we were before 1994. And some of this is caused directly by what our leaders do and fail to do. The second thing is that the world is experiencing hyper-capitalism. Capitalism, or this evil of capitalism, has never been this bad. So we're going through a phase of hyper-capitalism. A hyper-capitalism that has attached itself to fascism in places like America, to the fascism of some who are South African and some who are former South Africans who live in places like America. So hyper-capitalism means not only in this country, but in the world as a whole, levels of inequality have never been this bad. Look at how the richest 1% lives compared to the poorest 50%. They live large. But look at the institutions that support them. Governments are one example, including our own, by the way. I always say that politicians should not be paid through the fiscus, should not be paid through the taxes that citizens pay. I always say that actually, in almost every country in the world, including this one, politicians must be paid by banks. Because all over the world, governments do more for banks than they do for the so-called ordinary citizen. One of the central problems we face in the world and in South Africa is how financialized the economy has become. Central to that pathology is what I call banksterism, the gangsterism
Yes.
of banks and bankers. I'll give you an example. Think of any huge corporation in the world, Monsanto or any other, Bayer or any other, and think of the tech giants. Who supports them? Follow the money in this way. The hedge funds, investment banking, where do they put that money? That money is put in the pockets of thieves, people who steal, that we call billionaires. You don't become a billionaire. You take a billion. These are thieves and takers who are buttressed through hedge funds, investment banking, and so on. In countries around the world and South Africa, central to this pathology of the financialization of the economy is banksterism, the gangsterism of banks and bankers. And from who do they take? From the so-called ordinary person. In India, for instance, you know the stories of farmers who have committed suicide because a company like Monsanto has decided that seeds were invented by them, plants were invented by them, and therefore farmers must pay rent to them. The tech giants, the same thing. What do they produce? How do they make money? Through rents. And who do they use? Governments. And that is why I say it is not the citizen, but it is the bankster who must pay the salary of the politician, because the politician does more for the bankster than he does for the citizen. So the levels of poverty we see in South Africa and the world, the levels of inequality, unprecedented levels of inequality we see in the world and South Africa, are a direct result of this pathology I'm talking about. And I'm saying not only in this country, but all over the world, we are moving towards revolts by ordinary people. In this country, as I say, we are moving towards a perfect storm of discontent. The discontent of the poor, the working class, and the middle class.
What do you think is taking South Africans so long for them to, because they were going through a lot. I mean, the electricity prices, then we see the politicians, the state of crime, Umkwanazi, what he exposed. Why are we still, it's almost like we're helpless.
Well, look, we were promised, and we promised ourselves, a South Africa as a society that would be the antithesis of where we come from, apartheid society. We did something else. We failed to differentiate between the myth and the reality. What am I talking about? During the evolution of the struggle, the ANC at some point does become a myth. Some of its leaders become mythical figures. And we don't spend enough time examining the gap between the myth and reality. Because the gap is populated by the vain hope that post-apartheid South Africa will be the antithesis of apartheid society, not bearing in mind that to the extent that the class relations of apartheid society, the race relations of apartheid society, gender relations of apartheid society, must continue into our post-apartheid setting so that those who benefited from those relations must still have the upper hand. What we're ill prepared for is that it is those who claimed to act on our behalf in a struggle against apartheid colonialism who become the means by which these relations must continue in our apartheid setting. But I have no doubt, I am as certain as I am that the sun will rise in the east tomorrow, that if we stay on this trajectory, there will be an uprising in South Africa. An uprising of the poor, an uprising of the working poor, an uprising of the working class, an uprising of the middle class. What I call the perfect storm, because it is not humanly possible that South Africans will tolerate what they're going through indefinitely. You are right. Crime is out of hand. Our people don't have water. Electricity will soon be beyond the reach of many, if not most, South Africans.
Yep.
Literally, South African families are hungry.
Yeah.
What makes things worse? There is no evidence that South Africa has a government. There is no evidence that South Africa has a president. The president talks like an analyst,
Yeah.
an observer. But there's a reason why the president talks like an analyst. In addition to what I argued from day one, that this is the weakest leader the ANC has ever elected. And therefore the worst president South Africa has had since 1994. When he is playing the political analyst, it is because he thinks South African citizens are mojos. And he talks to us as one would talk to mojos. our president thinks we're fools. That's the problem.
Is politics still the answer, political parties? Because, I mean, it feels as if definitely we are not for ANC, but what are we for then?
Let me give you two answers. And this applies to the whole world, not just South Africa. So far, we have believed, and maybe here I should exclude women because it was not by choice. We have believed that our salvation will come from a powerful man. Nelson Mandela, Barack Obama, and so on. We have believed that human salvation will come from the deeds and words of powerful men all over the world. That's what we have believed. And we ignore the lesson of history. History is a ceaseless repetition of error, folly, and correction. Therefore, history is a ceaseless repetition of the errors and folly of men. The world is in crisis because of the errors and folly of men. It is because of the woefully poor leadership of men that South Africa is where it is, that the world is where it is. And we also miss a very important lesson. There is no society that can reach its potential by relying on half the population. In other words, it's illogical to think any society will achieve its full potential by relying only on men and excluding women or discriminating against women. In other words, what we do in the world when we discriminate against women is to choose to walk with one leg instead of two. That's what we do. And therefore, going back to education, and its reproductive function, and the fact that one of the dominant relations education reproduces are problematic relations between men and women, the gender question. Through education, we must work towards an order in which we can access the leadership potential of women. We must give women a chance. The men have failed.
It's exactly like that.
Having said that, we must give women a chance. Humanity must give women a chance, or perish in the folly and the illogic of relying only on those who have proved themselves incapable of providing the leadership that humanity needs. Men.
Gunin, we've been having this conversation so many times. We've seen we didn't have Winnie Mandela for president, the president that we missed out on. There have been so many women, you know, and instead, the vocal women get demonized instead. And then what happens is that the publics put the stupid men on a higher pedestal. So what is that psychologically? What does it say about the people? What does it say about our psychology as a nation?
It says many things. It says the transition from the world as it is to the world as we wish it to be is difficult. It says the transition from the world as it is to the world as we wish it to be is a transition that will happen through a process of many, many, many struggles. But I talk about this new consciousness that is emerging. It must be a consciousness on the basis of which we understand and embrace the idea and turn into reality the idea that the fundamental change that must happen is a fundamental change in our consciousness. Because of what I am, that fundamental change in consciousness is contingent on a change spiritually. Now, again, I'm not talking about spirituality as something like, as I said, the autopilot function of an aeroplane. There is no contradiction between spirituality and activism. And therefore, there is no contradiction between spirituality and struggle. But to succeed in the same way that we say we need to decolonize the mind of the descendant of the colonizer, we need to work on the mind, the gendered mind of the beneficiaries of patriarchy. Remember that if we come at this from the angle of, let's say, the colonial matrix of power and its different dimensions. Now, let me mention the dimensions in passing. And maybe in future episodes we'll go deep into the colonial matrix of power. Some of the dimensions are knowledge and subjectivity. That is, meaning. Who knows? Who do we regard as those who know? Who creates meaning? Generally, the answer is men. So that's the first dimension, which means the struggles we engage in, physical struggles, intellectual struggles, struggles of the mind, spiritual struggles, must first attack that dimension, knowledge and subjectivity. Who knows? Who creates meaning? Who is regarded as those who know? What do they know? Should it be taken for granted that what they know is good for society, is good for everyone? Another dimension, gender and sexuality. And of course, attacking that dimension of the colonial matrix of power means we must accept that this dimension is a dimension that has robbed humanity of the advantage of relying on all who are human. Instead, what we have done is to exclude and discriminate against those who are women. Why? Because coloniality as a logic tells us not only that those who are not white are not human, but it tells us that those who are not men are not human. So that's an important dimension to attack, so that we free ourselves from those shackles of gender and sexuality as a component of the colonial matrix of power.
It's amazing because black men understand racism, but then they don't understand the same gender issue when it's coming.
You know why? Link the colonial matrix of power to coloniality. Remember, two things are the main pathologies of the colonial matrix of power. Racism, that is white supremacy. White people are superior. Now, that logic does something else. The colonial matrix of power reduces us to bodies. We are not spirits. We are bodies. Some bodies are superior to others. The bodies of men are superior to the bodies of women. The bodies of women are inferior to the bodies of men. The bodies of those who are black are inferior to the bodies of those who are white. Now, if you look at what is happening in America, a country right now that is led by a white supremacist, fascist regime, and you see the logic of that regime in other parts of the world, particularly in Europe, re-emerging. Which means the colonial matrix of power remains.
Reaffirms itself.
Yes. Unlike the ANC, is succeeding in renewing itself.
Where does that take black liberation then? Or just the liberation of everybody in the country, because now there's lots of us actually. So how do we maneuver?
Well, remember, Mami, what this colonial matrix of power and coloniality do. Remember, the bodies are divided according to race and according to gender, and in other ways. But what they do is to create a hierarchy. At the top of the hierarchy is God. And for me, God comes in two ways. There's God, full stop. And there's the God of our creation. So God is at the top of the hierarchy. Below God is the white man, who is godly, who is the embodiment of God, who is a representation, physical representation of God. So to go against the white man, to go against what the white man thinks or does, is to go against God.
Yeah.
Below the white man is not the black man, is the white woman. Below the white woman is the black man. And right at the bottom is the black woman. We need to attack this. Because, as I say, unlike the ANC, the colonial matrix of power and coloniality are succeeding in renewing themselves. And that is why America today is run by a fascist, white supremacist regime. South Africa may not be run by such a regime, but the mentality of that regime we see every day in this country. And that's why they run to America to talk about a non-existent genocide. Because they themselves are governed by the same white supremacist, fascist logic that governs America today.
How come you're moving away from talking about the political parties? Have you given up on them totally now?
Well, let's go back to the question of whether politics will save us. Politics, as what we know it to be right now, is not going to save humanity. Because politics, as what it has become, as what we know it to be, politicians and political parties are not going to save humanity. Therefore, we must do two things. One, politics is what we have today. Within the constraints of what politics is, what opportunities exist to improve the human condition? That's the first question. That question presupposes acceptance of the fact that politics, politicians, political parties are a constraint we must overcome. Therefore, within that constraint, what opportunities exist to improve the human condition? For me, that's one of the main questions we must discuss. Now, I am interested in a national dialogue. I am not interested at all in the national dialogue. I am interested in a national dialogue which, amongst other things, has a conversation around this question. We accept that what politics is, what politicians are, what political parties are, all over the world, not just here, are not the answer. But that is what we have now. Because that is what we have now, within the constraints imposed by that reality, what opportunities exist? Or are we going to create? Or must we create in order to improve the human condition? For me, that is one of the main questions a national dialogue, a global dialogue must deal with.
So we're cutting off all the parties. We're not interested because you're not even mentioning MK. You're not mentioning any of them.
Well, so this answer applies to all of them. Whether it's the ANC, whether it's the EFF, whether it's the MK party, whether it's the DA, whether it's the Patriotic Alliance, whether it's the Kwankwaetla, I don't care. They are not the answer, but they are what we have. I suppose the question I'm asking is a variation on the theme. How are we going to work with what we have? So within that question, of course, we can have conversations about whether the ANC is the answer, whether the DA is the answer, whether coalition government is the answer. My own view is that in the foreseeable future, and I'm talking about a period of the next 30 years, it may be more, but I'm limiting myself to 30 years. Our electoral or post-election reality over the next 30 years will be that of coalition government. So I suppose if I'm asking the question, within the constraints imposed by what politics has become, what politicians have become, what political parties have become, how can we make coalition government work for our people? I am not arguing that it is possible for coalition government to work optimally. It's not. The fundamental change our people dream of is not going to be delivered by any election. I think I said to you before the last election that we can have 1 million elections. Not even one of those 1 million elections is going to deliver the fundamental change we desire, because those 1 million elections are themselves part of the constraint I'm talking about. And therefore, the question I'm asking, what opportunities exist within the constraints we have to change the human condition for the better? Applies to elections too.
The elephant in the room is always Abo Rupert.
Yes.
You know, the owners of the economy.
Let me interrupt you. Sorry. It's an elephant that is doing a very poor job of hiding itself.
Yes, it's got a pink tutu on and it's dancing. And the question is always around this national dialogue, this a national dialogue. Where do they fit in? Because they are hoarding all the resources, and the reason we're having to have these dialogues is because of them. So how do we approach the situation?
Well, let's go back to where I started. The fact that certain relations must be reproduced. Class relations, economic relations, gender relations, race relations, for instance. Let's isolate economic relations and class relations. Or let's treat both as economic relations. In whose interests must they be reproduced? In the interests, I said, of the hyper-capitalists. In the interests of the banksters. In the interests of those whose economic interests have become dominant in this country and the world. They must be reproduced. by what means do they reproduce these relations, dominant relations? I isolated education as an example. Popular culture is another. So they have many devices they use to reproduce these relations. The media is another. Now, take 6 o'clock today. Many radio stations at 6 o'clock every day have business program. Whether you're listening to SAFM or Hot 102.7, whether you're listening to 702 or Power FM, 6 o'clock today you'll be listening to business news. And this programming does nothing to give us a critique, not of the state of businesses, but of the state of the economy. Yeah. Now, there's a report that has just come out, authored by Open Society, about who owns South Africa. And of course the question, who owns South Africa economically? And by what means do they own South Africa? One of the examples they give is that of regulatory capture, which is a form of state capture which has been with us for a long time. But we were obsessed with a very narrow understanding of what state capture is, joining the wrong dots, leaving out the bigger dots. So the report says, for instance, one of the problems we have is that of a revolving door. Executives in the financial sector, in the banking sector, end up where? In the Reserve Bank.
Yep.
They end up where? In National Treasury. People in the Reserve Bank, in National Treasury, end up where? They become executives in the financial sector. Why? Because they are engaging in a particular form of state capture.
Yep.
Regulatory capture. The struggles that we must engage in include a change in mindset when it comes to understanding of things such as state capture. Yes, you had the 9 wasted years, which coincided with the presidency of Jacob Zuma. These were 9 wasted years of ANC misrule. And by the way, if the Constitution allowed it, Zuma would still be president of South Africa if he had not tried to tamper with National Treasury. You don't tamper with National Treasury. You don't tamper with the Central Bank, the Reserve Bank. These are the citadels of capitalism in South Africa. So if Jacob Zuma had not tried to capture National Treasury, if the Constitution allowed it, he would still be president today. So you had the 9 wasted years of ANC misrule. For some reason, some tomula with Jacob Zuma, and we remove him from the ANC. Those were 9 wasted years of ANC misrule. Who was the main facilitator of what we call state capture? Narrowly conceived by us. The ANC. The main actor that abetted and facilitated state capture was the ANC. So these were 9 wasted years of ANC misrule. And the misrule, in part, was about looking the other way when it comes to what I call banksterism and state capture through regulatory capture through this revolving door. Executives in the financial and banking sector use to access National Treasury, to access the central bank, to influence the content of policy and regulations.
Does that mean that Madiba and Mbeki turned the other eye to what was happening in Treasury?
Well, I have always argued to my friends in Treasury that one of the problems is that our National Treasury is a state within the state, a law unto itself, until, of course, they collided with something this year, during the budget process of this year. And the ironies, or one of the ironies about National Treasury is that it becomes a law unto itself, a state within a state, an actor that acts with impunity, unbridled impunity. What did it use to reinforce its position? The ANC's majority. It is the ANC's majority that our National Treasury used to reinforce its position as a law unto itself, as a state within the state that is governed by the laws of capital, not the laws of the country. So they use
the majority
the majority
the
of the ANC.
majority.
Well, all the majorities
Yes.
that they had. Remember, what is the first thing the ANC does after winning almost 70% of the vote in 2004, 69.69%? The first thing the ANC promises is that it will not amend the Constitution. Whose fears was the ANC worried about? White people and white capital. So, National Treasury and white capital, monopoly or otherwise, actually use the ANC's electoral majority repeatedly to reinforce their interests.
Kudlaliwe ngathi.
Kakhulu senziwe isibhanqa. Nangoku sisenziwe isibhanqa.
So then how do we remove ourselves from Bupan?
Well, I will keep on using the same boring word, struggle. We must decide what those struggles look like. We must decide what the content of those struggles are. One of the main ingredients is unity. We must unite behind an agenda that will be achieved through these struggles. But the starting point is a national dialogue must be about what the content of those struggles is going to be. And I say, not just a national dialogue, a global dialogue. Because this hyper-capitalist reality we live in is unsustainable for humanity, the planet, and other planets. Because now the hyper-capitalists are polluting space, are polluting other planets. They intend to colonize other planets. You know why? Because they know they are killing this planet. But they have this illusion that when the end times come, because the reason they live like there's no tomorrow is because in their minds the end times are coming. And when the end times are coming, they must be safe, either on other planets, or they must create safe zones for themselves in different countries and different parts of the world.
Yeah.
That is why they consume as if there is no tomorrow.
At our expense.
Yes, at the expense of humanity and the planet. Soon, it will be at the expense of other planets.
Do you think that there's a reversal of this, or we must just accept that evil is winning?
Well,
Are we in an era where evil is winning?
I am hopeful that if enough of us in this country and in the world unite against what you rightly call this evil, I am convinced that if enough of us unite, we can defeat hypercapitalism and the hypercapitalist and their allies, the politicians and governments. We can defeat them. And that is why I am saying the world is going to face rebellions and revolts in different countries around the world, because the conditions under which as human beings we must exist are intolerable. And this trajectory of hypercapitalism and what it imposes on the human condition and on the planet is unsustainable, or to use your word, is evil. And it is an evil we must unite against in South Africa and in the world.
Enkosi Gogo.
Tamako.
We're looking forward to more engagements as you unpack more of these. You make it so much easier for us to understand. Thank you very, very much.
Tamako.
Thank
Mami.
you. Umoya ulight, umoya ubright. That was Gogo Aubrey Matshiqi. He'll be back. You know this. Thank you to everybody liking, sharing, and subscribing. And thank you especially to the members who help us keep the lights on. Thank you so, so much. And thank you for watching the adverts to the end. Guys, we'll see you again next time.